Thank you very much. Well, I guess we are almost there. Probably everybody is exhausted, but also very energized and loaded up with electronic structure theory know-how. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an amazing service to the community that Christian Carbagno, Christian Rasch, IPAM, Volker Bloom, and Matthias Scheffler are doing with this for the students and postdocs attending, as well as for the rest of us. I also want to thank them for giving this opportunity to present some of our recent work under the general umbrella of the materials genome. So I was given this rather broad and ambitious and daunting title, the materials genome. I thought about it a little bit and immediately decided to narrow it down, right? For the same reason that you just mentioned. So what I'm going to do is to give a general overview, which will somewhat overlap with the previous talk, Sadashivan Shankar's talk. Overview that's semi-technical, semi-historical, and which allows us to understand the name, the materials genome. And then I'll go on to some of our recent work in the area of polymer dielectrics design, which, as I said earlier, falls under that umbrella. So that's the plan for the next 45-50 minutes or so. Let's now step back a little bit and ask the question why materials genome, and clearly it came from the other genome, the biological genome, and let's take a look at it very briefly, very quickly. Many of us know how this works, but let's just go through certain things, and I'll try to draw some parallels between this and the materials genome and some non-parallels as well. So this is really the molecular logic of the living state. So you have a double-strand DNA, which is made up of four distinct building blocks. The transcription process takes you to the RNA, again made out of four blocks, except that your thymine T block is replaced by a U block. Other than that, there is really no difference. There are four blocks that make it up. The translation process, when you go to the next stage, what happens is each triplet, every possible triplet codes for an amino acid. Right? Since there are four blocks, there are 4 times 4 times 4 possible triplets. That's 64 triplets. There are 20 amino acids, it turns out, and we'll see how that maps together shortly. So each one here is an amino acid. You have a triplet, an amino acid, tryptophan in this particular case. Another triplet codes for another amino acid, and so forth. You have a string of amino acids, which is your protein. Right? So the definition of your strand, this one-dimensional information over here, gets translated to another sequence of one-dimensional information which defines your protein. Of course, it's a big challenge to go from this one-dimensional structure, the primary structure, to the tertiary structure, and which is what eventually defines the function of your protein. But anyway, we are going to leave that out for the purpose of today's discussion, and just focus on the fact that we can go from here to here using what we call as the genetic code. So here is your table of 64 possibilities, right? So this is the first block, second block, and the third blocks are over there. So there are 64 possibilities over there, and you see that there are three items over there which indicate stop. These are full stops, which is what makes a single strand lead to multiple proteins, enzymes, right? So this is the other genome, and of course knowledge is really going from here to there, right? Now, okay, so that's the other genome, the biological genome. What about the materials genome, right? So here you have 4 blocks. With the materials genome, you have 100 or so elements of the periodic table. That immediately increases the complexity. Secondly, this is one-dimensional information. With our materials genome, it's 3-dimensional information. These elements, these atoms can arrange, organize in 3-dimensional space, and not just in crystalline form. And the previous speaker already pointed out the complexities involved. Periodicity, crystallinity can be interrupted by defects of various types, voids, interfaces, etc., leading to an enormous complexity. To make things worse, this map is not available for materials in general. Subclasses of materials may have this. For example, the Hume-Rothery rules for metal alloys are some kind of a code, some kind of a rule, set of rules. But for the general materials, class of materials, this whole framework does not exist yet. It exists for subclasses, but not for a unifying theory is not available, and I don't know if it will ever be available. It's a daunting task, right? So what the community is trying to do is to attack pieces of it, pieces of the puzzle, one at a time, right? Okay, so I'm going to give a flow chart, which is somewhat of an overview for how we are all addressing this materials genome problem. We have the chemical and the physical space. What do we mean by that? Well, physical space is the structure. Let's say we have a fixed structural template. Gus Hart talked about it yesterday. Let's say we have a fixed structural template and we have a lattice, and at lattice points you're placing atoms. The only variables are the identity of the atoms, let us say, which means we are playing with the chemistry. So chemical space is what is being explored for a fixed structural space, but we do want to make it general enough eventually. Later on in my talk, I will actually talk about that. Okay, so if we start off with something and we do either experiments or computations very carefully, very accurately to get a desired set of properties. So we have the property space right now, and if we go through this process a lot, very well, if we know how to do this very well, this is where the level of theory sophistication comes into play. If we go through this a lot, we accumulate a lot of data, and so we need databases. The materials project is one example. There are many that are coming up right now in order to properly organize and manipulate the data. But that's not enough. If we have the databases, we want to mine the data for rules, like the genetic code. Certainly, Hargobind Khurana, when he figured out the genetic map, had an enormous amount of data to come up with that code, right? So the rules will have to be obtained by looking at the data, and of course, we can do probably better. We can search better, search effectively. We can make predictions. We can do what we call as machine learning. Machine learning basically includes this and that, and perhaps that will lead to knowledge and discovery. So that's the general framework that many of us are adopting. But the point I want to make is that with respect to materials, in some sense, it's far more complex than what was originally thought, right? So chemical space is staggering. The physical space is equally staggering. And we need to develop methods to go from here to there at varying scales, length scales, right? It's a multi-scale problem, as has already been pointed out by many people. What I'm going to do right now is to show you an example, right? I mean, there are many subclasses of that have been already addressed. For example, Jens Norskov and company have looked at the catalysis genome. Gus Hart and Chris Wolverton and Volker Bloom and many others have looked at the metal alloy genome, and so forth. What I am going to show you is a pedagogical example from the recent literature, the ABX3 genome. So this is a compound that exists in the perovskite type structure. So if I'm assuming everybody knows what this is, but if in case you don't, imagine a cube. The A atoms are at the corners of the cube, the B atoms are at the body center of the cube, and the X atoms are at the face centers. That works out to ABX3 stoichiometry. A and B are cations, X is an anion, and X can be, for example, oxygen, and a couple of common prototypes are lead titanate, barium titanate, and so forth. What these people have done is to look at this chemical space, and they've attempted to identify promising ABX3 compounds for this photocatalytic water splitting process. And to do that, they've identified a set of criteria, right? So first of all, a given compound has to be stable. It has to have the right amount of band gap. It has to have band edges at the right locations to allow for the H2 and O2 production. And what they did was to look at an enormous space, right? So A and B, they considered to be one of, they drew from a pool of 52 metals. Right? And that immediately gives you 52 times 52, 2,704 possibilities for a fixed value of fixed choice of X. So for X3, they again considered 7 different possibilities. So 7 times that 2,704 gives you around 19,000 cases. So they did DFT calculations on all of this, and it's all available in a database, the Computational Materials Repository. And from that, they decided to screen based on these criteria and identified 20 candidates which meet their stability criterion, which meets their band gap criterion and the band edge criterion. Think about it. They had to do 19,000, 20,000 DFT calculations to get 20 candidates, which passed ultimately. So success rate was 0.1%. Okay, so if they went on to do something else, they pretended that they knew no physics, no solid state physics, no chemistry, and no geometry. And they decided to identify rules, right? So they came up with these rules. So they did some kind of a few different machine learning techniques were adopted, and they tried to identify what we can learn from the data. So you have 19,000 cases. They basically found that for a compound to be stable, to be a stable insulator, it has to have even number of electrons per unit cell. Of course, we know that that has to be the case. The sum of the oxidation states will have to be 0 per unit cell, and the A element has to be larger than the B element. Right? If you knew some chemistry, some physics, and some geometry, you would actually figure this out. But they wanted to all of this to emerge from the data. Here is another interesting analysis. So here is a probability that a particular atom would like to be in the A site, and another particular atom could be in the B site. So what you can see is that if you see blue, red stuff, high probability is high. If it's white, the probability is low. You can see that calcium, strontium, barium, etc. want to be in the A site. Titanium, zirconium, hafnium, tantalum, etc. want to be in the B site. These lead to well-known AbO3, AbX3 compounds. Right? So these things emerge from the data. But still, you have to do 19,000 calculations to figure all this out. Do you really need to? Is a question. And further work, in further work, they basically used an evolutionary algorithm to see if they can get to the 20 cases, the 20 target cases quicker, without doing 19,000 calculations. Right? So they used an evolutionary algorithm, and they were able to show that yeah, sure, if you were to randomly pick cases until 20 hits are done, it takes you pretty much 19,000. But if you use this evolutionary algorithm, the best genetic algorithm that they were able to tune was able to get to the 20 results in like 3,000 or so DFT calculations. Right? So this is, as I said, it's an example. It's a pedagogical example for how this genome is trying to, materials genome problem is being attacked. So here is the same chart I showed earlier, and here are some tags that I've added that applies to this example I just showed. Right? The physical and chemical space that they targeted is basically that. In fact, they explored the chemical space for a fixed structural template. Cubic AbX3 was chosen, and for that fixed structural template, they just probed chemistry. Right? And of course, computations were performed, and their target properties were those. But one should note that much work needs to be done. Right? So this class of compounds are well known for other interesting properties, multiferroicity, for instance, piezoelectricity, pyroelectricity, other functional behavior. So there is much that could be done. The database, as I mentioned earlier, is within the Computational Materials Repository. They identify rules. They mine for rules based on valency, oxidation state, and size. And they use a genetic algorithm to do their learning and predictions. And and sorry, to seek and find the answers quicker. Right? So that's an example. Now, let us pause for a moment, and I'm going to make a few comments that are in line with what the previous speaker made. Let us pause for a moment and ask the question as to what really constitutes impact, right? When do we know that a particular material is going to have an enormous impact? And how long does it take from scientific discovery to actual impact? Prototype, technological prototype, let us say, right? And the answer to this question, it turns out, depends on when you ask the question. At what point in history you ask this question. One can answer this question by simply looking at some successful cases in the past. Right? That's kind of what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through this very simple exercise of looking at, considering some of the materials that have very deeply influenced humanity, right, in the past. I'm going to show 4, but there are many, many more. And each of us, if we go through this exercise, would probably come up with different examples, right? But this is just my list. Right? One of them, I would say, is iron and steel. Right? So this is the material of power. Weapons and tools and buildings and bridges are made from iron and steel. But the history of iron and steel is very old. Right? It goes back to 2000 BC in what is today Turkey, in that area. And then the next big step was made in South India, it turns out, and then it moved on to Damascus, leading to the Damascus sword. And then it was in the 1800s that it entered mass production. It was at that time that utilization of steel, railroads, bridges, and buildings exploded. So now today, the steel industry is considered as an indicator of economic progress, right? But it took 3,000 years. Another example of mine is paper. This is the material of knowledge. It's something that most material scientists don't even consider a material, right? In fact, it's kind of ironic I should say this, because we are at a time when we are trying to go paperless, right? Yes. So anyway, history of paper is long too, right? It goes back to China. 180 bamboo pulp was used to make the first generation of paper, and then it moves to the Middle East, and then to Europe, and then it's 1400, the printing press comes online, books are manufactured in mass, and the history of reading begins. Interestingly, the history of reading is only 500 years old, widespread reading, right? And of course, that's going to happen eventually, right? We all know that. No, it's good. Polymers, another example, right? Again, it goes back a long, long time ago to the Mayans, but if you ignore, but this was, it was not known though, it was forgotten. It was rediscovered in the 1800s by Charles Goodyear, and the first application of vulcanized rubber was tires, automobile tires. And then, of course, a series of discoveries led to plastic outstripping steel, displacing steel, and of course, now polymers are everywhere. Right? How can I not mention silicon? I think the previous speaker already talked about it a little bit. It's a short history, right? It's a short history of silicon. So now there is a trend over here, 3,000 years. About 1,000 years, couple of centuries, couple of decades, right? So we are getting better. We are getting better at discovery to mass production or impact, but certainly not as good as him, not as good as Iron Man, right? So he's standing in front of this periodic table and choosing the elements he wants to make a magic material to do something, right? So we are not there yet. Hollywood is ahead of us. But anyway, let me make a few notes. Already people talked about high throughput computing and experiments. That's necessary. Database creation, important. Data mining, important. But really, if we want to do that effectively, it's not just one or the other, it's all of them. It's all of them, And more importantly, how do we need to figure out how to deal with complexity, how to collaborate, how to work together with the experimentalists, etc., etc. There is this nice, very recent article. It's a review article about the Materials Genome Initiative, which I think was, which I believe was a result of an NSF workshop, which I think Matthias Scheffler was part of. But anyway, so that's a very, very revealing article. So that's where we are. So what I'm going to do at this point is switch gears and talk about some work that we have been involved in for the last 3 years. We're going to talk about polymers. Okay, so let me motivate this work first. What you see here is a parity plot, which sure everybody has seen. It's a plot to show where energy storage technologies live, right? So power density versus energy density. You got batteries over here, which have a very high energy density, meaning you can store a lot of energy, but the power density is very low, meaning that it takes forever to charge and discharge. Right? On the other end of the spectrum, you got capacitors, which are super fast. Power density is very, very high. You can charge and discharge very fast, but the amount of energy you can store is very low. Energy density is very, very low. So the project that we are working on is to expand the domain of the capacitor. And if we can expand the domain of the capacitor, these would be high energy density capacitors. Right? Time scale would still be fast, low, but the energy density, amount of energy you can store would be very high. For many, many applications, I'll show a couple in the next slide, capacitors are really the only option for rapid charging and discharging. Right? And here is the metric. In that ABX3 example I showed, I identified a few screening criteria. Here, what would be a good capacitor dielectric depends on the energy density. Right? So maximum energy density is actually simply given by a very disarmingly simple looking equation. Dielectric constant times the square of the breakdown field. That's the highest electric field you can subject the material to. Because if you subject it to anything more than that, it's going to fail. But the energy density, the maximum energy density is the dielectric constant times the breakdown field square. What are the options for making such capacitors? Sure, we can use ceramics because they have high dielectric constant, but the problem is that ceramic materials break down catastrophically. When they fail catastrophically. Right? Polymer films, on the other hand, when they are metallized and made well, they don't fail catastrophically, they fail gracefully, they fail gradually. So that's what you need for many applications such as capacitor bank in a car, in a hybrid car, medical defibrillators, and so forth. Right? So you don't want catastrophic failure, you want graceful failure. And these are also preferred for large area applications. Make them in large scale and wind them up like those. Each one here is a roll of a capacitor. Right? So polymer films are really the only option for this class of applications. But what is currently being used? The Toyota Prius, for example, has capacitor banks made out of polypropylene. It's a simple hydrocarbon-based polymer. It has a large breakdown field. It has a low loss, and we won't talk much about loss here. It's very cheap. It's very easily processable, easy to make films out of them. But the problem is it has a very low dielectric constant. Right? And because of that, its energy density is 5 joules per cc. The idea is to increase this by either increasing this or increasing the breakdown field, or both. Right? How do we do that? How do we surpass polypropylene? Is a big question. And so now I list our screening criteria. Right? So we are searching for the organic and organometallic. We'll get to organometallic eventually, but organic and organometallic chemical spaces for materials with high dielectric constant, high breakdown field, low loss, high temperature stability. We want them to be stable and easy to make films. Right? The first one we know how to calculate. Breakdown field is a tough one. I'll talk about it at the very end of my talk. The loss we actually don't know how to calculate. So we are going to cheat a little bit. We are going to use the band gap as a proxy for breakdown field and loss. Turns out that there is empirical evidence that the band gap is directly correlated with the breakdown field. And likewise, the band gap is inversely correlated with the loss. Higher the band gap, lower the loss. And so, two properties, the dielectric constant and band gap, to screen and search. Right? And it's a big project. It's funded by the Office of Naval Research, and there are 5 universities involved, and about 30 students, postdocs, and faculty members in this project. So it's a complex problem. Polymers are fairly complex beasts. The morphology is pretty scary. They are not single crystals. They can be polycrystalline, they could be amorphous, etc. So we need to somehow deal with that. Most of the stuff I'm going to talk about will deal with the fragments of polymers. And so we are going to be looking at the molecular level for the most part. We use density functional theory calculations, effective medium theory. We use structure prediction using various methods. And then we do some machine learning, etc., to arrive at our goal, which is to find those interesting materials.
So what's the length scale on the far left? Is it a few hundred nanometers?
Yes, exactly. Correct. Okay, so here is the scheme we have adopted. So we start off, this should remind us of our DNA, right? So it's a one-dimensional strand. That's our repeat unit, let's say, which contains 4 distinct blocks. And we are going to draw from a pool of about 7 possibilities. So each of these blocks can be any one of those 7. And the reason we chose those 7 is because those ones lead to many commonly known polymers. Okay? So, but of course, if we do 7, so we have 7 possibilities for each of these blocks. So you have an enormous number. So you have 7 to the 4 total cases. But if you use some chemical intuition, we'll realize that not all of them make sense. For instance, you cannot have all of them as oxygen or all of them as CO, right? So based on these notions, we can knock out a bunch of them. We can also use symmetry. We can use periodicity, inversion, and so forth to eliminate a bunch more. And it turns out that we will end up with a few hundred possibilities in the end, few hundred distinct cases in the end. So we then do DFT calculations to compute the dielectric constant and band gap for those cases. Bear in mind these are single strands, single chains. So we calculate the dielectric constant, and somehow we need to get to what the dielectric constant would be in a bulk polymer. So we use effective medium theory to do that. And then once we identify some promising cases, we don't want to stick with the single chain situation. We want to figure out what the secondary, tertiary structure would be. So we use structure search methods. In this particular example, we used a couple of different techniques to determine the 3-dimensional structure of those promising polymers. And then we once again calculate the properties to make sure that what we had originally calculated makes sense. And finally, we pass that on to our experimental synthesis colleague. And hopefully they can make it, and they look good. That's the hope, right? Okay, some results. So that's our fragment, 4-block situation drawn from the pool of 7 possibilities over here. What you see here is a dielectric constant, the electronic part, as a function of the band gap. It's a log scale, and you can see very interestingly things lining up. If you draw a line over there, the slope is of course -1, and we understand why that is. If you look at so the point is that there is a trade-off between the electronic part of the dielectric constant and the band gap. Right? The ionic part, on the other hand, does not have that. There is some kind of a scatter, so we can exploit the ionic contribution in principle. And that's the total. This plus that is that, essentially. And this is polyethylene, which is very similar to polypropylene, which we are trying to surpass. A large band gap, but low dielectric constant. So where we really want to be is this, the sweet spot over there. Medium, moderate band gap, and somewhat large dielectric constant. That's where we want to be. And if we go there and take a look at what are the systems that occupy that region, we see that they're all occupied by systems with the NH, CO, or CS, and at least one aromatic group. Right? So we are getting some clues as to where we want to go with the synthesis. We identified 3 specific cases, and we wanted to now look at them deeper. Right? So that's what. Okay, well, before that we need to predict the three-dimensional structure. So one approach that we used is we use the modified version of the USpec code from Artem Oganov's group in Stony Brook, and his postdoc is actually in the audience somewhere. So we used that. We used a modified version of the open the USpec code, where we can preserve the connectivity of the fragments of the groups of the blocks in order to predict its three-dimensional structure. Then we also adopted another technique using force fields. Fortunately for this system, force fields were available, so we were able to do a melt and quench. This was done by our collaborator in Columbia. Using a melt and quench approach, we were able to predict the structure of that particular case, polymer. But we considered 3 of those, right? There are 3 candidates we identified. Interestingly, this falls under the polyurea class. That's a urea, turns out. Urea is a generic compound, and this is a specific one. That's a polyimide. This is a polythiourea, where the difference between this and that is that CO is replaced by CS. Okay, so what you are seeing here are the structures that are predicted using the evolutionary approach as well as using the force field. So there are, I'm just showing the 4 lowest energy structures, quite close in energy, and those are the structures. We computed the band gaps. We use hybrid functionals to get the band gaps, and we have the dielectric constant total as well as the electronic for all of those cases. Likewise, we did it for all these other 2 other polymers, and here are some actual results. Turns out that our experimental colleagues were able to make all 3 of them. Okay. So what you see here, unfortunately, perhaps it's not too visible back there. I apologize for that. What you see in the bottommost here is the XRD spectrum. Okay. So if you're not able to see it, you have to just take my word for it. So that's the XRD spectrum of the experimentally synthesized and measured situation, and these other spectra are from the predicted structures. And if you look closely, the agreement is pretty good between the experiment and one of the predicted cases. So the XRD measurement will give you information about long range order, so this is the infrared, which gives you information about the short range coordination and so forth. That's the experimental result, and these are the predicted. And again, you can see if you look closely that the peaks line up, which is very favorable. And this is the dielectric constant that is measured as a function of frequency. That's the measured dielectric constant, and these points that you see here are the predicted dielectric constant of those cases. And that's the loss, which we are not going to touch. We cannot calculate that. We don't know how to get to it right now. And I'm not going to belabor this point. These are the same sort of results for the 2 other cases. Looks great. It's very rewarding that what we predict has been made and measured, and things line up. At this point, we could have proclaimed victory and said we did materials design. But unfortunately, there are other considerations, and Sadashivam Shankar already pointed this out. None of them can be made into films. They are too rigid. They are not very useful as polymers, as polymer films for any application. Right? How do we make flexible thin films out of them so that they are actually useful? So this is where our experimental colleague came in. Very creative person, Greg Satsing, and Yang Chao is our electrical characterization colleague. So they came up, they took one of our polymers, which we predicted would be very good, and made some changes to that. They added a couple of CH2 units to it and made it processable and made films out of that. And here is an example. This is an actual picture of an actual film that was made out of that synthesized material. And this once again, now we had to go take that compound, take that fragment, that is the periodic repeat unit. We needed to do calculations on them. Here is our predicted structure, which was predicted using the USpec code. And again, XRD measured, this is the measured, the black stuff is the predicted. IR spectrum measured versus the predicted for 3 different cases of predictions. And the dielectric constant and dielectric loss. And And because they were able to make a film out of that, they were able to actually make a measurement of the breakdown strength as well, the breakdown field. Turns out that it is very competing with polypropylene in the first shot. Right? So it has a dielectric constant that is more than double that of the current material, and a breakdown field that is almost equivalent to the current material. The loss is still somewhat high, so we need to still do some work, but looks like it looks very promising. We are on the right track. So this is the story so far on this organic polymer design idea. So this is what I've walked us all through. Now the next question I want to ask is, can we do better? Right? Can we explore the chemical space and the physical space more extensively? And is there something interesting to be found, to be discovered? Right? If we go back to our periodic table, organic polymers have carbon as the backbone. I mean, not necessarily the backbone, but it's a vital constituent of organic materials. You have carbon. If you go down the periodic table, you get to silicon and germanium. Then go down further, tin, lead, and so forth. So this is a very interesting column of the periodic table because it's the boundary between metals and non-metals on either sides, left and right. And you also go from insulators, from a classic insulator to a good metal as you go down the column. Right? So question is, if we start replacing carbon with silicon, germanium, tin, etc., are we going to see something interesting? Right? And hydrogen in our conventional hydrocarbon, if you replace the hydrogen with fluorine and chlorine, maybe we can exploit the ionic part of the dielectric constant. Right? So we began to do this kind of a basic study. We considered group 14, so that's our group 14 elements, group 14 hydrides and halides. Right? So anyway, when we look at the group 14 hydrides and halides, we find that we see a dizzying array of possibilities in terms of chemistry, in terms of coordination environment. For example, if you have carbon, silicon, germanium, tin, lead, all of them, but if they are hydrides or chlorides of some of them involving carbon, coordination number is 4. So you can go all the way from coordination number of 4 to coordination number of 8 in lead fluoride, and in between, right, depending on what you are looking at. If you look at the properties of interest to us, the band gaps are very high when you have chlorides and fluorides, low when you have the hydrides. The dielectric constants systematically increase as you go from carbon to lead. Right? So that's the electronic part of the dielectric constant. This is everything else. And there is something interesting with tin. Tin is peaking over there. Right? So it's giving us some clues as to what we should be doing. Right? So we go back to our one-dimensional fragment, one-dimensional chain, and that's our repeat unit. And we now, instead of our organic blocks, we consider group 14 base blocks. Okay? CH2 is our parent original compound, and then SiF2, GeF2, etc. Right? So we do this, we play games with these blocks now. There are 7 of those. And here, this is, again, one thing I should note is the advantage of something like this is that we are keeping the structure the same. We are holding the structural template a constant and playing only with the chemistry, just like with the ABX3 example. Okay? So structural template is that. We don't allow anything to happen. We just change the chemistry. And here what we did was, okay, we have a few hundred possibilities. We do DFT calculations on those, but we wanted to explore this chemical space, this space much further, right? So let's go back. Let's go back to this example here. If you had 4 blocks per repeat unit, it turns out that you will have a few hundred distinct cases, assuming that you're pulling each block from this pool of possibilities. If you just make it 8, instead of 4, if you just have 8, you have 30,000 possibilities. So you are encountering a combinatorial explosion. We don't want to do 30,000 DFT calculations. We want to do 200 and see if we can predict the 30,000. Right? So that's where we did some machine learning. So that's this work here. So this picture actually tries to summarize the various steps that we took in doing our machine learning. So we have different cases. These are our actual materials. And the first step is to represent each of the material as a vector, as a numerical vector, right, which we call as a fingerprint. Or you could call it as a feature vector, or you could call it as descriptors. Right? So these points came up yesterday. What is really critical is to come up with a fingerprint vector, a feature vector that is invariant, and Matthias Rupp pointed this out yesterday. You cannot just use the Cartesian coordinates of the atoms of our system because those coordinates, that vector, would not be invariant with respect to translations, rotations, inversions, and permutations. So we need to come up with a set of numbers that would be invariant to such operations, linear operations. So we get to that. So once we have that, what we do, we define distances. We use kernel ridge regression, which we heard about yesterday. So for that, what goes into the regression, what goes into the learning is essentially the distance between these vectors, these feature vectors. It's the distances that go into the learning. So the distances will have to be suitably defined. In this case, we define them using the Euclidean norm. Right? Okay, now let me say a few things about the learning process itself. Is straightforward. It's actually this is the step that is critical. Defining the descriptors, defining the fingerprints. Right? How did we do it? We were kind of inspired by the cluster expansion approach. Right? So our fingerprint is very simple. It's based on the number of singles, meaning number of times a CH2 unit occurs or SIF2 unit occurs and so forth. So there are seven components. The first 7 components of our fingerprint vector describe the singles, the number fraction of singles, of each single. And then the next 7 represents the number fraction of each double, CH2, CH2. How often does CH2, CH2 occur in our case, in our system? And the next 7 represents the number fraction of triples. We could just go on forever like that, but we stopped at triples. Okay? So we have a fingerprint that has 21 components. That was our fingerprint. And the beauty of it was that it's invariant to all of these operations that I described earlier. Here are some results. So we do the learning, we do cross-validation, we do the usual stuff. And here are some results: machine learning versus density functional theory for 8 different properties. Energies, atomization energy versus formation energy, lattice parameters, spring constant, electron affinity, band gap, dielectric constants. So there are 3 classes of data here, three sets of points here. So we have our 200 or so examples of systems that have 4 blocks in the repeat unit. Which we break up into a training set and a test set. So the training set is represented by black squares. The test set is represented by red circles. And then we considered some 8 block repeat unit cases. More expensive to calculate using DFT, but we did a few of those, and those are also here. So we can actually predict. Yes?
I'm confused. What is the horizontal axis in the first, let's say, plot?
That's the density functional theory prediction of that particular property. So in each plot, the vertical axis is the machine learning prediction, and the x-axis is the DFT prediction of that particular property. Okay. So it's very reassuring that many of the properties are calculated with very good accuracy. Right? So this now takes us to something else that we could do. A basic question we would like to ask is, what do we really use this machine learning for? What is its use? What is its utility? Either we try to identify correlations, like what we are doing here, and like what the ABX3 example showed us. We try to mine for rules, correlations from the data to learn the system better. Or we try to identify an optimal solution based on a few expensive calculations. You want to find the most favored solution. Or we want to go to a domain we have not visited in the past. The third one is a big problem. I mean, I don't know how one would go about doing that, but that would be a good direction to go. But here we are restricting ourselves to the first one, unearthing some correlation. Right? So we have 8 properties. Here is a parity plot again, which shows to what extent any pair of properties are correlated. Right? If you look at it this carefully, you will find out that the band gap is correlated very heavily with many of the properties. And that's what is shown here. Atomization energy versus band gap, lattice parameters, etc., right? Everything is plotted against the band gap. And you can see interesting trends. And but for this application, what we are really interested in is this correlation here, dielectric constant versus band gap. If you look at, this is our sweet spot, large dielectric constants, reasonable band gap. What are those cases? First of all, the ionic part dominates, but more importantly, this whole section here is dominated by tin-containing groups. If you recall what I showed earlier with this game we played with the group 14 hydrides and halides, tin was showing up prominently, and tin keeps showing up here as well. Right? Okay, so we want to go into tin now. Polymers containing tin, organo-tin polymers, right? So the thing is, here was a challenge. So we had a battle with our synthesis colleagues. We wanted them to make something, they can't make it, they come back to us with something else, right? So first we said, initially we did not consider tin, we went down only until germanium, and said germanium is looking really interesting, can you make germanium? And they say germanium is way too expensive, there is not enough budget in our grant to buy enough germanium. Tin is very cheap on the other hand, can you go down further in the periodic table? And then we included tin in our calculations and said, oh yeah, tin is great, tin is fine too. And then they said, well, no, we cannot make that, but we can make something else called tin esters. What on earth is that? I had no idea what tin esters were, and it turns out that it's this. So it's got a certain number of CH2 units. It can vary from 0 to some number. And then you have a tin there which is coordinated with oxygens and methyls and so forth. So they figured out, using their process, how to incorporate tin in an organic situation. Right? So what we did now was we considered a variety of, so this is the general formula for the tin ester. So we considered a variety of them. They actually made it before we could do any calculations. They made this particular compound. They showed that the loss was very low. This is a very low value for the loss. Dielectric constant is reasonable, and then they said, okay, guys, you can do your calculations involving tin esters. Okay, so we use this minima hopping method to predict. We need to first predict structure because this is not a simple 1D strand anymore. It's kind of a network structure, and so we really needed to predict the structure first to be able to predict the properties next. So structure prediction using minima hopping, and what is plotted here is the dielectric constant as a function of the number of CH2 groups over here, and we get a lot, our results are over there, and the experimental values are in red. So there is some kind of agreement between experiment and theory, and so we are quite excited by this whole tin business, and we are getting deeper into tin, and we want to understand why tin is behaving so interestingly, and so we are looking at various situations where tin is part of an insulator, right? First of all, let's take a look at this plot, a dielectric constant versus band gap. If your compounds consist of only carbon and hydrogen, hydrocarbons, that's the red square, those are right there. Very low dielectric constant for a variety of band gap values. The moment you include oxygen, right, you have now carbonyl groups, CO groups, and those are the triangles, so you pop out of that behavior. So you have some interesting cases. So then these are the tin esters that we considered earlier. So those are the squares. They are really getting out. They're going out of this trend over here. So tin is all up there. Okay, thanks. And then we wanted more data. We wanted to explore this chemical space more extensively. So we went into the MOF database, MOF Metal Organic Frameworks, because here there are several nice databases which provide tons of information, tons of crystallographic information on MOFs. So we looked at MOFs that contain tin. Right? So that's those symbols over there. You see a bunch of them. Right?
So this is an example of a morph. This is our tin ester. Some of the morphs actually have tin in a similar environment to the tin esters. So we are trying to understand, we are now in the process of, this is future work, we are now in the process of trying to figure out what really contributes to what is really tin, what is tin really doing? Right? So we are in the process of doing some machine learning. We are trying to derive fingerprints, descriptors, feature vectors that involve tin in a complex environment, but that is not ready for discussion yet. So we are still working on that. We add this to the database, and you see here we have the dielectric constant and band gap as a function of tin volume fraction. We are really trying to tune into what tin is really doing. Look at the dielectric constant as a function of tin content. Of course, as the tin content increases, the dielectric constant increases, but for a given tin content, there is a wide variety of possibilities for the dielectric constant. Something is going on. There is some environment of tin that is better than others. We need to learn better what is going on here. Okay, experiment versus computation, right? So this is a plot I showed earlier, various tin containing cases as well as the organics. Organics are down here, tin is all up here. This is experiment. Organic polypropylene, polyethylene there, and then our experimental colleagues considered a variety of other organics as well, polyurea, polythioureas, we already discussed that, but also organometallic, meaning just tin containing polymers, they are all up here. So the point is, by carefully choosing organic blocks, one can improve upon polypropylene. That was the first part of my story. Organometallic polymers could lead us to an important part of the chemical property space, which is that. But there are many, many other issues we need to contend with. We are not done, of course, we are just starting. There are many issues. The interface is very complex. The previous speaker pointed that out already. We are still looking at very idealized single crystal, for the most part, environment. Polymers are very complex. They are generally not single crystal. There are interfaces with the metal electrode. We are not yet really treating them well yet. Needs to be done. And then I want to spend a minute or so talking about breakdown. This is something we have not really touched yet because we don't know how to compute the breakdown strength. As devices become small, as films become thin, the electric fields that they encounter are becoming bigger and bigger, and at some point this breakdown of dielectric breakdown is going to become an important thing to contend with. What is it? How do we go about calculating it? We went back decades to the work of Froelich and von Hippel in the 1940s. There is a phenomenological theory that's available to estimate the intrinsic dielectric breakdown field. And this is, what do I mean by intrinsic breakdown field? It's the breakdown field of a perfect insulator in the absence of any defects at low temperatures. Okay. So we implemented that. So it involves treating the electron-phonon interactions. If it's defect-free, the only thing that's important is electron-phonon interactions. And here is our calculated intrinsic breakdown field versus the best available measured breakdown field for a bunch of classic insulators. Right? So this is a log scale, so it spans about 2 orders of magnitude. Yes, more than 2 orders of magnitude. So we can somewhat get close to predicting things right in terms of the intrinsic breakdown strength. Of course, this is not the full story. We're extending this to study a variety of compounds, not polymers, but classic insulators. Right, the group 14 elements, as well as 3,5 semiconductors, 2,6, and then 1,7. And you can see what you see here is calculations that we have done using LDA and PBE, as well as available experimental data for some of the cases. So you can see that there is somewhat reasonable agreement. But what is also interesting are the trends. You see, the trends are kind of unmistakable. Right? We need to learn this better, and we need to improve upon this. How can we go beyond just the intrinsic breakdown strength? So I want to finish with this last slide, right? So here is a flowchart I had shown earlier. This is going to be an enormous challenge. We need to handle the chemical and physical spaces right, realistically. We need to be able to predict properties accurate enough. We need state-of-the-art computational tools, and of course, we need to synergize. We need to speak and converse with the other part of science, the experimentalists as well. So with that, I'm going to finish up. Let me thank the people who actually did the work. The lion's share of the first part, the organic polymer design part of this project, was actually done by Ghanshyam Pilania, Chen Wong, and Vineet Sharma. So Ghanshyam Pilania has graduated, he's gone, he's now at Los Alamos National Lab. And then the organometallic part of the work is being done by Huan Tran and Lihua Chen, and Ying Sung and Chiho Kim are working on interfaces and the breakdown behavior. Venkatesh Botu, he has attended this workshop. He's not working on this project, he's working on a different project. I'm glad he was able to attend this workshop. And I will not have a story to tell today, but for my collaborators. Right? So this is, as I said, it's a big project. There are many components to it. What I've presented today has a significant DFT or computational slant to it, but there are other things going on at the University of Connecticut as well as at Columbia University, Akron, Penn State, and RPI. They are all part of this project funded by the Office of Naval Research. And I should also thank Professor Artem Oganov and Cheng Zhu, who's sitting over there, for their participation as well. And finally, I want to thank you all for your attention.